My grandmother's will said I was worth $1. Not a house, not a memory, not even a kind word. $1. My father pressed the coin into my hand and told me I didn't deserve a cent more. My brother laughed, spat near my shoe, and called me worthless while the rest of my family watched like I was nothing. And the worst part was, for 1 second, I believed them. But what they didn't know was this. Grandma had planned the whole thing. She wanted to see what they would do when they thought I had nothing. And when the attorney reached for a sealed file nobody was supposed to see, every smile in that room disappeared. I used to think silence kept the peace. That morning taught me silence only protects the people causing the pain. When my family laughed at that $1 coin, I finally understood something. Being useful to people is not the same as being loved by them. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Then stay with me, because this is the story of how $1 exposed an entire family. My father pressed a $1 coin into my palm like he was handing a tip to a parking attendant. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You don't deserve a single cent more." The room went quiet for half a second. Then my brother Chandler laughed. Not a polite laugh, not nervous. He laughed like the whole thing had been arranged for his entertainment. We were sitting in Sherry Routier's law office on a gray Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after my grandmother Thelma was buried. The office smelled like coffee that had sat too long and paper that had outlived the people who signed it. My family had dressed like they were attending a business luncheon instead of the reading of a dead woman's will. My father, Murdaugh Whitmore, sat near the attorney's desk with his hands folded over his belt buckle, calm as a judge. Chandler sat beside him, leaning back in his chair, one ankle resting on his knee. My sister Jody kept her purse on her lap and her eyes on the floor. I wonder if you've ever sat in a room full of family and realized you were completely alone. That morning, I did. I hadn't come there expecting riches. I need you to understand that. I had my own job, my own little house, my own bills. I was 44 years old enough to know money can make a family polite, but it can't make them kind. Still, a small part of me hoped Grandma Thelma had left me something that said, "I saw you." For 7 years, I had been the one taking her to appointments, fixing the porch rail when it came loose, changing air filters, hauling groceries into her kitchen, sitting with her during the long afternoons when her hands shook too much to hold a coffee mug. Chandler showed up when contracts needed signatures. Dad showed up when land values came up. Jody came by on holidays if there was a picture worth posting. I came because she was my grandmother. Sherry opened the first folder and began reading in that steady, legal voice attorneys use when families are already sharpening knives under the table. Dad received control of the old Whitmore acreage. Chandler received voting rights tied to the family business. Jody received a rental property and a generous cash distribution. Each name brought a soft breath of relief, a smile, a satisfied shift in a chair. Then Sherry said, "To my grandson, Talon Whitmore." My chest tightened before I could stop it. "I leave the sum of $1. No one spoke. I heard the air conditioner click on. Then Chandler covered his mouth, but not well enough. His shoulders shook. A cousin across the room let out a little clap, like somebody had landed a punchline. Dad stood slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the coin. I realized then that he had brought it with him. He had planned this part. He walked over, placed it in my hand, and curled my fingers around it. "You don't deserve a single cent more." Chandler leaned forward, his smile thin and mean. "That's because you're a worthless loser." Then he spat near my shoe. Not on me, not quite. Close enough to make his point. Close enough for everyone to see. Close enough for Jody to turn her face away and pretend she hadn't. That hurt more than Chandler's words. I looked around the room, waiting for one person to say, "Enough." Nobody did. So I slipped the coin into my coat pocket. I didn't know why I kept it. Maybe because throwing it back would have given them the scene they wanted. Maybe because some part of me knew I would need to remember that moment exactly as it happened. I stood to leave. In my mind, the story was finished. My grandmother was gone. My family had finally said out loud what they had been telling me in quieter ways for most of my life. Then Sherry closed the folder. She didn't look at my father. She reached beneath her desk and pulled out a second sealed file. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice suddenly much firmer. "Before anyone leaves, there's one more document your mother instructed me to read." Nobody moved. A minute earlier, my family had been laughing like the will reading was over and I was the joke they all came to see. Now every chair seemed nailed to the carpet. My father's hand was still on the back of his chair. Chandler had been reaching for his phone. Jody had already tucked her purse under her arm. Sherry Routier laid one palm over the sealed file and looked at my father with the calm patience of someone who had handled ugly families before. "What document?" Dad asked. His voice had changed. "Not much. Just enough for me to hear it." Sherry adjusted her glasses. "Your mother gave specific instructions. This portion was not to be opened until the first section of the will had been read in full." Chandler gave a short laugh, but it didn't land this time. "Come on, Sherry. You're telling me Grandma planned a little surprise party?" Sherry didn't smile. "I'm telling you I intend to follow the document exactly." That was the first strange thing that happened. Someone said no to my father, and the ceiling did not fall. She turned to me. "Talon, I need to verify your identity before I continue." I was still standing, my coat half buttoned, the dollar coin sitting in my pocket like a hot stone. "My identity?" "Yes. Full legal name, date of birth, and current address." Dad stepped forward. "Why would you need that from him?" "Because the document requires it." "I'm her son," he said. "I have a right to hear whatever my mother left." Sherry looked up at him. "You will hear what you are permitted to hear." The room went still again. I answered her questions. My full name, my birthday, my address. My voice sounded steady, which surprised me, because inside I felt like someone had just pulled the floor out from under the building. Sherry broke the seal with a letter opener. The sound was small, but everyone heard it. She unfolded several pages, scanned the first one, and began reading. "This memorandum concerns the Whitmore Family Preservation Trust, established by Thelma Whitmore and amended in final form 6 months prior to her passing." Chandler sat up. Dad's face tightened. Sherry continued. "The trust includes investment accounts, land interests, and private holdings valued at approximately $14.6 million. A cousin whispered, "What?" I didn't speak. I couldn't. Then Sherry read the line that changed the room. "Upon my death, the sole successor trustee shall be my grandson, Talon Whitmore." At first, I thought I had misunderstood her. So did everyone else. Chandler stood so fast his chair scraped backward. "That's fraud." Sherry closed the document halfway and looked at him. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore. You expect us to believe Grandma left him in charge of anything?" Dad pointed at the file. "There's been a mistake. My mother would never put family assets in Talon's hands." There it was. Not anger. Not yet. Fear. I had spent most of my life trying to get them to look at me. Now they all were. Let me ask you something. If everyone around you repeated the same lie for 20 years, would you eventually believe it too? Because right then, watching their faces change, I realized I had believed more of it than I wanted to admit. Sherry kept reading. "The trust could not be accessed casually. There were conditions, legal reviews, documents only I could examine, instructions Thelma had placed under attorney-client privilege." Dad demanded copies. Sherry refused. Chandler accused me of playing innocent. Jody finally spoke, but only to whisper, "Dad, maybe we should listen." He turned on her so quickly she looked down again. While they argued, a memory came back to me. Grandma on her porch, wrapped in a blue cardigan, though the afternoon was warm. She had asked, "Talon, how do you know someone loves you?" I had said, "They stay when they don't need anything." She had smiled then, quietly, sadly. Now I understood that she hadn't been asking a question. She had been taking inventory. The meeting ended badly, but it ended. My father suddenly wanted a private conversation. Chandler's voice softened like wet paper. Relatives who had laughed at me 20 minutes earlier now touched my shoulder and said things like, "You know we're family." No, I didn't know that. As I stepped toward the hallway, Sherry stopped beside me and slipped a cream-colored envelope into my hand. On the front, in Grandma's shaky handwriting, were 6 words. "Open this only when alone." I stared at those words, not knowing the envelope carried a secret strong enough to crack the Whitmore family wide open. By the time I reached my apartment, the afternoon had already settled into that dull gray light that makes everything feel older than it is. I did not drive straight home at first. I circled a few blocks, stopped at a gas station I did not need, and sat in the parking lot with both hands on the steering wheel. My phone kept lighting up in the cup holder. Dad. Chandler. 2 cousins who had not called me in 6 years. I let every call go unanswered. When I finally walked inside, the place felt smaller than usual. It was not much. A 1-bedroom apartment with a kitchen table that wobbled if you leaned on the wrong corner, a couch I bought secondhand, and a stack of maintenance manuals beside the TV. My family always treated that apartment like proof I had failed. They never asked why I stayed there. They never knew how many checks I had written for Grandma's prescriptions when insurance dragged its feet, or how many Saturdays I spent replacing boards on her back steps, or how often I filled her refrigerator because pride kept her from asking anyone else. I took off my coat and heard the coin hit the table before I realized I had pulled it from my pocket. $1. It sat beneath the kitchen light, bright and useless. I looked at it for a while, not because I cared about the money, because I kept hearing my father's voice behind it. "You don't deserve a single cent more." Then I opened Grandma's envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, several copied trust pages, and a smaller envelope with a brass key taped to the front. The first line stopped me. "My dear Talon, if you are reading this, then my final test worked exactly as I hoped." I leaned back in the chair. Test. So the $1 had not been a mistake. It had not been some cruel accident buried in legal language. Grandma knew. She had arranged it. For a moment, anger rose in me. Sharp, immediate. I wanted to ask her why she would let me sit in that room and be humiliated. Then I kept reading. "I needed them to show you who they were when they believed you had nothing." That sentence hit harder than anything Sherry had read aloud. Grandma wrote that she had watched the family for years. She watched who came by when property taxes were due, who visited after hearing land values had gone up, who remembered her birthday only after an attorney appointment appeared on the calendar. And she watched who stayed after the checkbook was closed. She wrote about the hospital waiting rooms, the grocery bags, the nights I slept in the recliner because she was afraid of falling. She wrote about the winter her furnace went out and I missed 2 days of work to get it fixed. Then came the part that made me put the letter down. She knew about the Whitmore warehouse contract. 7 years earlier, I had found an error in a supply schedule that would have cost the company a fortune. I called Dad, explained the issue, and sent him everything. At the next family dinner, Chandler was praised for saving the deal. I had never told Grandma, but she knew. Tucked behind the letter was a printed email from Dad to Chandler. "Talon is useful in the background, but he is not leadership material. We will present this through you." I stared at that sentence until the words blurred. That was my family in one line. Take what I gave. Hide my name. Tell me I was lucky to be included. My phone rang again. Chandler. This time he left a voicemail. "Look, Talon, we got off on the wrong foot today. Let's not make this uglier than it has to be. You know how Dad gets. Call me back so we can handle this like family." I almost laughed. A grown man could mock you in public, let shame do its work, and then call it the wrong foot when money appeared. If the people who hurt you only apologize when they need something from you, is that really an apology? I turned the phone face down and went back to the letter. Grandma explained the trust. Private investments, property sales no one tracked closely, old mineral interests, accounts she had kept away from the family business because she knew what greed did to people who called it tradition. "The money," she wrote, "is not the gift. The responsibility is." The trust was meant to protect vulnerable relatives, caregivers, and eventually older people who had no one steady in their corner. It was not a prize. It was stewardship. That word stayed with me. Stewardship. Not revenge. Not victory. Duty. Near the end of the letter, the writing grew uneven. There is one more thing you must know. There is a reason your father started treating you differently 20 years ago. I read it twice, then a third time. 20 years ago was when everything changed. Before that, Dad had been distant, but not cruel. After that, he seemed to look at me like I reminded him of a bill he did not want to pay. Grandma continued, "The explanation is in the security box hidden at my house. Use the key. Go alone, and do not tell your father until you understand what he is afraid of." I picked up the small brass key. A note was folded around it in her shaky handwriting. "The truth about your father was never meant to stay buried forever." I sat there until the apartment grew dark, the coin still on the table, the key in my palm, and my whole life beginning to tilt toward a secret I was not sure I was ready to find. The next morning I drove toward Grandma's empty house, unaware that by sunset everything I believed about my family would be shattered forever. I reached Grandma's house a little after 9. The neighborhood was already awake. A lawnmower hummed somewhere down the block. A delivery truck slowed at the corner, then rolled on. Everything looked ordinary, which made the house feel even more painful. Her rocking chair was still on the porch, angled toward the street the way she liked it. The cushions had faded from sun and rain, and one of her flower beds had started to droop. I stood at the bottom step longer than I meant to, holding the key she had left me. A key is a small thing, until it opens the part of your life you were never allowed to understand. Inside, the house still smelled faintly of lemon soap and old wood. I locked the door behind me, not because I thought anyone would come in, but because the letter had told me to go alone. Grandma was careful. If she wrote that, she had a reason. I followed her instructions to the basement. The stairs creaked under my shoes. Down there, the air was cooler and thick with dust. Storage shelves lined the wall. Christmas decorations, old paint cans, a broken card table, boxes labeled in Grandma's handwriting. I moved slowly, checking behind shelves, then under a stack of folded quilts. For almost an hour, I found nothing but memories. A photo album from my high school graduation, a coffee tin full of buttons, Dad's old baseball glove. Then I noticed the shelves in the far wall did not sit flush against the paneling. I pulled one forward. It resisted at first, then shifted with a dry scrape. Behind it was a narrow section of wood with a small round latch painted the same color as the wall. My hand paused before I opened it. Part of me still hoped this would be simple. A few bank papers, maybe an explanation that hurt less than I feared. It was not simple. The compartment held a metal security box. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside were folders, photographs, medical paperwork, old letters, and a sealed statement with my name written across the front. I sat on the basement floor and began sorting. At first, the papers made no sense. Some were letters between Grandma and attorneys. Others were private notes, dates, copies of family records. But one year kept appearing again and again. 20 years earlier. The same year my father stopped calling me son, unless other people were listening. The same year Chandler began introducing me as the help with our last name. The same year I learned that a family can push you out without ever asking you to leave. I opened the sealed statement last. Grandma's handwriting began neatly, then weakened halfway down the page. "Talon, your father's anger was never born from anything you did." I had to stop there. My eyes moved back to the first line, as if reading it again would make it less dangerous. She explained that 2 decades earlier, Murdaugh had discovered a private family truth connected to my birth, my mother's final years, and old inheritance expectations inside the Whitmore estate. The details were not scandalous the way gossip makes things scandalous. No crime, no grand courtroom secret, just pride, betrayal, and reputation. The 3 poisons my father understood best. He had believed one thing about the family line, the business, and his place in it. Then he learned he had been wrong. Grandma wrote that he felt humiliated by people he could no longer confront. My mother was gone. Certain relatives were dead. The older generation had already buried their part of the truth. So he turned his resentment toward the one person still standing in front of him, me. I was not the wound. I was the reminder. That sentence sat in the room with me. For years, I had treated my father's coldness like a puzzle I was supposed to solve. I worked harder, I stayed quieter. I tried not to need much. I told myself, if I became useful enough, decent enough, steady enough, he might finally look at me without disappointment. But the papers in my hands told a different story. I had been punished for a history I did not create. What hurts more, being hated for something you did or being punished for something that was never your fault? I don't know how long I sat there. The basement light buzzed above me. Dust floated in the beam. My knees ached from the concrete floor, but I did not move. Then my phone started ringing. Dad. I let it ring. A message followed seconds later. Talon, this has gone far enough. We need to meet as a family before you make a mistake you can't take back. Then Chandler called. When I ignored him, he texted. There are legal complications you don't understand. Don't let Sherry use you. Use me. That was rich coming from a man who had spent his whole life standing on work other people did. I kept reading. At the bottom of the box was one more letter from Grandma. People who build their identity around power rarely give it up willingly. That line made my anger settle into something colder. Not fear. Awareness. My father was not simply upset. Chandler was not merely greedy. They were cornered men with polished shoes and respectable last names, and people like that rarely shout at first. They threaten through lawyers. They whisper to relatives. They call pressure concern. I gathered the documents carefully and placed them back in the box. Before closing it, I checked beneath the folders one last time. A final envelope slipped loose. Across the front, Grandma had written, "Only open this after they start lying." I stood in that basement with the box in my hands, listening to my phone vibrate again upstairs. Driving home later, with Grandma's documents beside me on the passenger seat, I could not stop staring at that last envelope, because deep down, I already knew exactly what she expected my family to do next. By the time I carried Grandma's box into my apartment, the sun had dropped behind the buildings and the windows had gone dark enough to show my reflection. I looked tired, older, like a man who had found answers and somehow felt less certain than before. For the next several days, the box stayed on my kitchen table. I told myself I was organizing the papers, but mostly I moved folders from one stack to another and stared at the final envelope without opening it. My phone never really stopped. Dad left messages that sounded calm at first. Talon, we need to discuss this reasonably. Then colder. You're not equipped for this. Then sharp enough to show what sat underneath. Don't mistake a document for wisdom. Chandler tried a softer approach. We're brothers. We can fix this. Then, 2 hours later, if you embarrass Dad, you'll regret it. Relatives I barely knew sent texts about unity, forgiveness, and keeping Grandma's memory clean. That last one bothered me most. They had ignored her loneliness, but now they wanted to protect her memory from the only person who had actually sat beside her. 3 nights after finding the box, I agreed to a video call. Not because I trusted them, because I wanted to hear how far they would go. Dad appeared first, sitting in his home office beneath framed photographs of company banquets and hunting trips. Chandler joined from his truck, sunglasses still on though the sun had set. Jody showed up last, quiet as usual. Dad folded his hands. Talon, we need to do what's best for the family. There it was. The family. He said it like a church bell, like a sacred thing. But whenever my father said family, he meant the people whose names mattered to him. I had never been included unless work needed doing. Chandler leaned toward the camera. Nobody's saying you don't deserve something. We're saying this is too much responsibility for someone in your position. My position? I asked. You know what I mean. No, I said. Say it. He looked away. Dad stepped in. This isn't productive. The call lasted 40 minutes. They used words like healing, legacy, fairness, and transition. Not once did anyone apologize for the will reading. Not once did Chandler mention what he had done near my feet in Sherry's office. When I ended the call, my apartment felt painfully quiet. That was when the lose-lose truth settled in. If I moved forward, I could break what little remained of the Whitmore name. If I backed down, the lies would stay dressed as tradition. Dad would keep his authority. Chandler would keep taking credit. Jody would keep surviving by looking away. And someone else, one day, would be taught the same lesson I had been taught. Be useful. Be quiet. Don't ask to be seen. Late that night, I opened my laptop and started drafting a letter to Sherry. I wrote that I wanted to explore transferring some authority to a neutral third party. I told myself it was mature, peaceful, practical. But my hand stopped over the keyboard. Peace is not always peace. Sometimes it is just surrender with better manners. The next morning, I went to the assisted living center where I still helped with small repairs when they were short-handed. I needed fluorescent lights, coffee in paper cups, people with real problems. Something normal. During lunch, I sat with Merrick Dawson, a young maintenance aide who worked harder than anyone noticed. He was wiping grease from his fingers with a napkin, talking about a supervisor who kept taking credit for his work. Then he shrugged and said, "How long do you keep letting people tell you who you are before you start believing them?" He did not know what that sentence did to me. I looked at him and saw myself at 26, tired, useful, hoping if I did enough, someone would finally say I mattered. That evening, before I could send Sherry my draft, she called. "Talon," she said, "your grandmother left a protected recording." I sat down slowly. She instructed me to release it only if I believed you were preparing to walk away. I said nothing. A moment later, Grandma's voice came through the speaker. Thin, gentle, certain. "If Talon tries to quit," she said, "tell him this. They didn't break you. They trained you to survive." I covered my mouth with one hand. Her voice continued, softer now. She talked about the appointments, the long evenings, the repairs, the years I gave without asking to be paid back. She said I had mistaken endurance for weakness because my family had taught me to be ashamed of kindness. Then she said, "The proof is already there, sweetheart. Don't spend your life begging blind people to describe the light." That was when I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for something old inside me to loosen. Sometimes the hardest thing is not fighting. Sometimes the hardest thing is believing you are worth fighting for. What would you have done? After the recording ended, I deleted the draft letter. Then I opened Grandma's final envelope. Inside was one sentence, 9 words. "They will call you family when they need you." I read it once, then again. By the time I set the paper down beside the $1 coin, I understood the real battle had not even started yet. I kept Grandma's 9-word note on the kitchen table for 2 days. "They will call you family when they need you." At first I thought that was the warning. I was wrong. That was only the beginning. The real warning came in the second line, written smaller beneath it. "The moment they fear losing control, they will attack your character." By the end of that week, the friendly messages stopped. No more, "Let's talk." No more, "We love you." No more, "Grandma would want peace." The mask came off so quietly I almost respected the discipline of it. I first heard the rumor from a woman at the assisted living center. Mrs. Parker was 81, sharp as a thumbtack, and never shy about saying what others only whispered. I had just finished repairing a loose cabinet door in the activity room when she touched my sleeve. "Talon," she said carefully, "is it true you pressured your grandmother before she passed?" The screwdriver nearly slipped from my hand. I looked around. 2 aides at the coffee station lowered their voices. A man near the window pretended to read yesterday's paper. "Who told you that?" I asked. Mrs. Parker looked embarrassed. "People talk. You know how families are when money gets involved." Yes, I knew exactly how they were. The rumors did not come like a storm. They came like dampness under a door. A neighbor heard I had isolated Grandma. A cousin told someone I had worked on her while she was vulnerable. Chandler told relatives I had not been helping her at all. According to him, I had been investing. That word spread fast because it gave lazy people an easy explanation. Greed is simpler than loyalty. Manipulation is easier to believe than sacrifice when the person being accused has always been the quiet one. My father never said much publicly. He was too careful for that. He used phrases other people could repeat without sounding cruel. "We're concerned about Talon's judgment." He may have misunderstood his role. Mother was very dependent on him near the end. That was how decent-looking people ruin you. They don't shout, they tilt their heads and call slander concern. At the center, conversations began stopping when I walked into rooms. Not every time, just enough. A receptionist who used to ask about my day suddenly kept her eyes on the computer. One volunteer moved her purse from a chair beside me before I sat down. Nothing dramatic. That made it worse. Big attacks give you something to fight. Quiet suspicion just follows you around and breathes on your neck. One afternoon, Merrick found me in the supply room, counting screws I had already counted twice. "You all right?" he asked. I almost said yes. That is what men like me are trained to say. Yes, I'm fine. Yes, I can handle it. Yes, it does not bother me. Instead, I said, "They're telling people I used my grandmother." Merrick leaned against the shelf. If they were telling the truth, why would they need a campaign? I looked at him. He shrugged. Truth doesn't need that much organizing. That sentence stayed with me the whole drive home. By the time I reached my apartment, I did not feel calmer exactly, but I felt clearer. Anger had been making me react inside my own head, rehearsing speeches I would never give to people who had already chosen their side. So I changed tactics. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and created folders. Calls, texts, voicemails, emails, public statements, witnesses, dates. Every message went somewhere. Every threat got saved. Every soft little accusation got written down. I stopped asking, "How do I make them understand?" I started asking, "How do I protect the truth?" 2 mornings later, I met Sherry at her office. She listened without interrupting as I laid out printed screenshots and notes across her conference table. When I finished, she folded her hands. "This is what I expected," she said, "but it's worse than I hoped. Can they take the trust from me? They can try. They'll likely allege undue influence, lack of capacity, maybe breach of fiduciary duty if they can invent a reason. In plain English, they're going to say you manipulated her, and they're going to pretend they're doing it for her honor." I stared at the papers between us. There was a time when that would have crushed me. That day, it did something else. It taught me the shape of the battlefield. Sherry began organizing a response: competency records, attorney meeting notes, medical documentation, time-stamped communications, witnesses who saw Grandma make decisions clearly, quietly, legally, methodically. No speeches, no begging, no family meeting where Dad could sit at the head of the table and rename control as love. Before I left, Sherry said, "Talon, don't respond to them directly. Let them keep talking." That feels backward. It isn't. People who lie under pressure often add details. Details become evidence. On the drive back, my phone buzzed with a text from Chandler. "Still hiding behind lawyers? That says everything." I did not answer. If someone spends more energy attacking your reputation than proving their innocence, what does that tell you? Late that night, after I'd finally shut off the kitchen light, Sherry called. Her voice was not frightened. Sherry did not do frightened, but it was tight. "They filed formal objections," she said. I sat on the edge of the bed. "Your father and Chandler are challenging the trust, but there's more." I waited. "They submitted a sworn statement claiming you manipulated Thelma during the final year of her life." For a moment, the room was so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen. As Sherry described the accusation, I realized someone had not just challenged the trust. They were trying to erase everything Grandma had ever believed about me. The formal complaint arrived 3 days after Sherry's call. She emailed me a copy first, then asked me to come to her office before noon. I read the first page at my kitchen table with the blinds half open and the $1 coin beside my coffee mug. Undue influence. Exploitation of an elderly person. Isolation from family. Financial manipulation. The words were clean and professional. That made them worse. They did not sound like lies shouted in anger. They sounded like something a serious person might believe if nobody showed them the whole picture. By the time I reached Sherry's office, I understood something clearly. This was not a disagreement over Grandma's money anymore. It was a fight over who she had been allowed to love. Sherry had folders ready when I walked in. Medical evaluations, attorney meeting notes, signed, affidavits, calendar logs from Grandma's appointments. She did not waste time comforting me, and I appreciated that. "They're building a story," she said. "We're going to build a record." For the next 3 weeks, my life became paper. Bank statements, doctor visits, witness calls, emails from years earlier, phone logs showing who called Grandma and who did not. Some nights, I drove home from Sherry's office with my shoulders aching from sitting too long. I heated soup from a can, answered nothing from family, and fell asleep with legal phrases still moving through my head. Exhaustion came back, but it no longer made decisions for me. Then, Sherry brought in Kiernan Blake, Grandma's longtime CPA. He was a thin man in his 60s, with careful hands and the worried eyes of somebody who had spent a career watching rich families behave poorly while pretending they were protecting tradition. We met in a small conference room with no windows. Kiernan opened his laptop and said, "Mrs. Whitmore was more aware than people gave her credit for." "I'm starting to understand that," I said. He pulled up emails going back almost a decade. At first, they looked ordinary: tax planning, trust revisions, investment summaries. Then the pattern appeared. Dad had tried to gain access to Grandma's accounts 7 different times. He called it simplification. He called it estate efficiency. He called it reducing confusion. Grandma had refused every time. Chandler had pushed too. Not directly at first. He asked about modernizing the family structure, then streamlining authority, then preventing outside influence. Outside influence. That was me. Kiernan pointed to one email from my father. "Mother is relying too much on Talon. That creates perception issues." I sat back. Not legal issues, not safety issues. Perception. That was my father's religion. Kiernan cleared his throat. "There is more. Your grandmother asked me to preserve all correspondence after that email. She expected this." I believe she did. The discovery changed the way I saw the whole fight. My father was not only after money. Money was part of it, but not the heart of it. He needed control. He needed the room to turn when he spoke. He needed the family name to mean his version of events. And I had become the one person standing between him and the story he preferred. That realization did not make him less cruel, but it made him smaller. Later that afternoon, Sherry reminded me of the protected video file. Grandma had recorded it with Sherry present. Her doctor had signed a capacity statement the same week. The file was sealed under instructions. "We do not use this unless we have to," Sherry said. "What's on it?" She looked at the closed folder between us. Enough. Nobody spoke for a moment. I understood then that evidence is not only power, it is responsibility. Once truth enters a room, it does not leave quietly. So we waited. Dad and Chandler kept talking. Every statement added another contradiction. Every accusation created another question. I stopped interrupting them. I stopped defending myself to relatives who had already rented space in their minds for the worst version of me. Sometimes, your family is the one that hurts you most. Not strangers, not enemies. Family. Would you still forgive them? That evening, I drove by the property Grandma had marked for the foundation. The building was empty then, just brick walls, dusty windows, and a faded for-lease sign leaning against the inside glass. I parked across the street and sat there as traffic moved past. For most of my life, I wanted my father's approval, like a man reaching for a porch light in the dark. I thought if it ever came on, I would finally know where home was. But sitting there, looking at the place Grandma had imagined, I felt something loosen. I did not need him to name my worth. He had never owned it. The next morning, Sherry forwarded the notice. A special trust hearing had been scheduled. Attorneys would attend, accountants, trust representatives, my father, Chandler, me. Every document would be reviewed. Every claim would be tested. And as I read the notice, I realized that within a few days, one side of this family would lose everything they had spent decades trying to protect. The hearing was held 4 days later in a private conference room that felt too clean for what was about to happen. No family photos, no warm lamps, No soft chairs, like Sherry's office. Just a long table, cold water pitchers, legal pads, and people wearing the kind of faces adults wear when everyone knows the conversation may change lives. Dad sat across from me in a navy suit. Chandler sat beside him, jaw tight, fingers tapping near his phone. Jody was farther down, quiet, hands folded. Sherry sat to my right. Kiernan Blake sat 2 seats away with a binder thick enough to make my brother nervous before anyone opened it. I kept my hands under the table. The $1 coin was in my pocket, not for luck, for memory. At first, everything sounded procedural. Trust representatives confirmed names. Attorneys reviewed the complaint. Sherry presented Grandma's medical capacity statements, appointment logs, legal notes, and records showing she had met privately with counsel. Then Dad's attorney stood, and the room shifted. He did not begin with money. He began with me. He said I had positioned myself as the gatekeeper around Grandma. He said I had benefited from emotional dependence. He said elderly people could be influenced by loneliness. The words were careful. That was what made them dangerous. Then Chandler stood. He looked right at me, but he spoke to the room. Talon wants everyone to believe he was some kind of saint. But let's be honest, he didn't love Grandma. He invested in her. For a second, I heard nothing else. That accusation went straight through every hospital chair I had slept in, every grocery bag I had carried, every quiet afternoon when Grandma and I sat together, because nobody else had time. A trust representative glanced toward me, then down at the file. That was when I knew written records would not be enough. Sherry must have sensed it too. She leaned close and said, "Are you sure?" I nodded once. She stood. There is a protected media file prepared by Mrs. Whitmore with counsel present and medical competency confirmed that same week. Given the nature of these accusations, we are submitting it now. Dad's face changed. Not much. Enough. The screen at the end of the room came on. Grandma appeared seated in her living room, a blanket over her lap. She looked frail, but her eyes were clear. Sherry's voice on the recording confirmed the date, the witnesses, and Grandma's understanding of what she was doing. Then Grandma looked into the camera. "If someone is playing this," she said, "then someone is claiming Talon manipulated me. Let me save you some time." Nobody moved. No one manipulated me, especially not the only person who stayed. Chandler's tapping stopped. Grandma continued. "Talon never asked me for $1. Not once. In fact, he tried to talk me out of leaving him anything at all. He said it would cause trouble." Her voice softened. And he was right. But trouble is not always a reason to hide the truth. She spoke about my visits, my repairs, the pharmacy runs, the nights I sat with her when breathing was hard. She named dates, places, things no one could fake. She described the very winter the furnace broke and said, "He missed work to make sure I was warm." My own son called 3 days later to ask about mineral rights. Dad looked down. For once, there was no performance left in him. When the video ended, nobody spoke until Kiernan opened his binder. He presented emails, trust requests, attempts by Dad and Chandler to move Grandma's assets under family management. 7 separate efforts, each refused, each preserved. One email from Dad appeared on the screen. "Mother is relying too much on Talon. That creates perception issues." Kiernan said, "Mrs. Whitmore asked me to retain that message specifically." Questions turned away from me, toward them, about motive, about timing, about why the complaint had been filed only after control shifted. The room that had once laughed at my $1 inheritance now sat in silence as the truth rearranged every chair. I reached into my pocket. The coin felt smaller than I remembered. I placed it on the table, not loudly, not for theater, just enough that everyone saw it. "This was handed to me at the will reading," I said. "I carried it because I never wanted to forget how little you thought I was worth." No one laughed. Chandler looked away. Dad stared at the coin like it had become evidence too. After a long silence, he asked, "So what happens now?" There were many things I could have said. I had rehearsed sharper lines in lonely rooms. I had imagined making him feel small. But revenge seemed cheap once the truth had done its work. I looked at my father, then my brother, then the rest of them. "I'm not here to convince you of anything anymore." That hit harder than shouting ever could, because sometimes the truth does not scream. It simply survives. The hearing ended with papers being gathered and chairs sliding back softly. People avoided my eyes, some because they were ashamed, some because they were calculating what came next. As I stepped into the hallway, one of the trust representatives approached me. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "there's one final decision only you can make." Walking out of that hearing room, I finally had everything I thought I wanted. And suddenly, the most difficult choice of all was standing right in front of me. The trust representative did not speak until we were standing away from the others. Through the glass wall behind her, I could see my father gathering papers with hands that no longer looked steady. Chandler kept his head down. Jody stood near the door as if she wanted to say something, but had spent too many years practicing silence. The representative lowered her voice. "Under your grandmother's final structure, you have authority to enforce all restrictions immediately. If you do, several Whitmore entities lose access to trust-backed guarantees." I understood enough. Dad and Chandler would not go to jail. This was not that kind of story. But their influence, their comfort, the old safety net they treated like birthright, could be stripped away in one legal motion. For 3 days, I lived with that choice. Part of me wanted to sign everything at once. Let them feel the ground disappear. Let Chandler learn what it meant to stand without someone holding the ladder. Let my father sit in the quiet he had built for me. But Grandma had not left me power so I could become a better-dressed version of them. So I chose accountability, not ruin. The trust restrictions stayed. Their control ended. Several business privileges disappeared. A planned property deal collapsed because Dad no longer had access to guarantees he once assumed were automatic. Chandler had to resign from 2 boards after Kiernan's records raised questions he could not answer neatly. I did not rescue them. I did not destroy them. For once, they had to live inside consequences they could not hand to someone else. 6 months later, Thelma Whitmore Foundation opened its doors. It was not fancy. No marble lobby, no spotlight. Just a renovated brick building with clean windows, sturdy chairs, and a sign by the entrance that read, "Support for caregivers, seniors, and the people who stay." Merrick became one of our first program directors. Sherry joined the advisory board. Kiernan helped set up the financial oversight so cleanly that Grandma would have smiled at every spreadsheet. The work was simple at first. Small grants for home repairs, rides to medical appointments, temporary relief for adults caring for aging parents, legal referrals for seniors whose families treated them like accounts instead of people. On opening day, I stood near the coffee table and watched an older man help his wife take off her coat. Nobody important would have noticed that moment. I did. A few weeks after the opening, my father came by. Alone. He looked smaller without Chandler beside him. Not weak exactly, just human in a way I had refused to imagine. We stood in the lobby where the late afternoon sun cut across the floor. He looked at the foundation sign, then at me. "I convinced myself you deserved less," he said. "That was easier than admitting I failed you. I had waited most of my life to hear something close to that. When it finally came, it did not fix everything." That surprised me. There was no music swelling in my chest, no sudden need to hug him. Some wounds are not doors. You do not open them once and walk through healed. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. He nodded, eyes wet but controlled. "I don't expect forgiveness." "That's good," I said gently, "because I'm still learning what it means." He accepted that. Maybe that was the first honest thing between us. Chandler's road was harder. Without Dad smoothing every path, he stumbled. Lost influence, lost invitations, lost the easy respect that came from sitting near power. I heard he took a consulting job that required actual performance, not just the Whitmore name. I did not celebrate it, but I did not pity him either. In the foundation lobby, we placed one item in a small glass case. The $1 coin. People asked about it often. I always gave the same answer. It reminds me that someone's opinion of your worth is not your value. That coin had once burned in my pocket. Now it sat under soft light, harmless and honest. The metal had not changed. I had. One afternoon, I received a message from a woman caring for her father alone. The foundation had helped repair his wheelchair ramp after her brothers refused to contribute. She wrote, "For the first time in years, someone made me feel seen." I read that line more than once, because that was all I had wanted too. To be seen without begging. To matter without proving. To count without being useful first. Have you ever spent years trying to earn love from people who had already decided not to give it? If so, what helped you move forward? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. That evening, after everyone left, I locked the foundation doors and stood outside as the sunset reflected in the glass. I thought about Grandma, the will, the laughter, the coin. Nobody laughed about it anymore. I smiled, not because I had won, but because I had stopped needing their permission to believe I mattered. The greatest inheritance my grandmother left me was not wealth. It was the courage to see my own value when nobody else would.